Hey guys, Will here. So today we're going to be taking a look at a brand new series of direct drive sim racing wheelbases. This is the VD series from sim racing brand PXN. Now, it starts with the VD4, 4 Newton meters of continuous torque, goes up to the VD6, 6 Newton meters, and the VD10 at 10 Newton meters of continuous torque. Now, these are very sharply priced, but they're entering a market which has a lot of competition. So not only do they need to provide a pretty amazing driving experience, but they also need to provide something unique, some kind of compelling reason why you might want to choose these over some of the more well-established brands within this sector of the market. So that's what we're going to be exploring in today's video. Stick around, this should be really interesting. Okay, so before we get started today, firstly, a big thank you to PXN for sending across this gear for us to check out today. Now, as we always like to do here at Boosted Media, we will be making some comparisons against some other competitor products in today's video, so it's important that you guys are aware that everything we'll be referencing has all been sent to us under the exact same conditions. So if you do decide you want to pick up any of the gear that we're talking about in today's video, or any other sim racing gear for that matter, head over to boostedmedia.net, and there you will find a whole bunch of discount codes and affiliate links. That's a great way of saving yourself a little bit of money and helping us out in the process as well. So we really appreciate your support there. But as is always the case here at Boosted Media, no third party has any sort of input whatsoever into anything we're talking about today. Everything I'll be talking about is purely just based on my own experience with using these products and their competitors. So with all that said, let's dive in now and give you some pricing information on this new VD series from PXN. So I'm aware that the pricing section of a lot of these videos recently has become quite difficult to digest simply because there's so many different products available these days. I end up just completely overloading you guys with information. So what we've done is we've put together a handy direct drive buyer's guide. Head over to boostedmedia.net or just follow the link down in the description below to find it. And there we have a list of all the direct drive bases that we feel are most relevant, that we've tested at least. And basically it's just going to give you a breakdown of where we think the value for money sits. You can click on each model and it'll give you more metrics on things like force feedback quality, overall ecosystem, all that kind of information. So it gives you a breakdown of each brand, a bit of a description there, and it'll also link you across to our more detailed written reviews and of course video reviews like this as well. So I'm not going to get too bogged down in pricing today, but I will just give you a quick rundown here. So at the time of filming, the VD4 4 Newton meter constant is only available as a bundle, so you can't buy the base just on its own, and it comes bundled with a 2 pedal set and a steering wheel, the one that you see just here. We'll go into the details on those as we get on through today's video. So that is going to set you back $299 US plus shipping and taxes. We do have a 5% discount code available, again linked down in the description below for you guys, so that will save you 5% off that cost. But one thing I will mention there is that PXN do have a pretty well established distribution network all around the world, so do just check local resellers, make sure you can't find yourself a better local deal and avoid some taxes and shipping costs. So don't just assume that that 5% discount is going to give you the best possible deal. Make sure you do shop around. So then we step up to the VD6, 6 Newton meters constant. That is available as a base only option, so just the wheelbase for $329 US plus shipping and taxes. Again, 5% discount code available for that as well. It's also available in various different bundles. So again, links down in the description so you can check out all those various different bundles. And then we step up to the 10 Newton meter constant VD10, which is available as a base only for $369 US plus shipping and taxes. And again, that 5% discount code is available. So we will flesh out these comparisons a little bit more as we get on through today's video. And of course, they are fleshed out more in our direct drive buyer's guide. But just to give you a couple of quick points of comparison here, a Moza R3 bundle, so 3.9 Newton meters. I believe that is peak though, rather than constant. We'll talk about the comparison there a little bit later. But that bundle will set you back $299 US plus tax and shipping. We don't have a 5% discount code available for Moza, so just keep that in mind. The Moza R5 bundle, which is 5.5 Newton meters, again, I believe peak, comes in at $439 US. We then have the Moza R9, which is available base only for $349 US, and the R12 available for $469 US at the time of filming. And those are both available in bundles as well. So pretty competitive pricing there, but you do just need to keep in mind that Moza are a more well-established brand overall with a much wider ecosystem of sim racing products available. Now, all of these products that we're talking about today are only PC compatible. So that does mean that you can mix and match and use any peripherals that you want with your PC. But if you do sort of place importance on the ecosystem and you want to keep everything within the one ecosystem, that may well be an important consideration for you. So there is, of course, also the new Simagic Alpha Evo models, and of course the Fanatec CSL DD, which is available both in bundles and as a standalone wheelbase. So head over to our written reviews and direct drive buyer's guide for a more detailed breakdown of the price comparisons there. So there you have a quick rundown on pricing, and hopefully you're starting to see how these products really do need to stand out against the competition in order to have a compelling reason to go this direction rather than something else, being such a saturated market segment these days. So what exactly are we getting for our money with these direct drive bases? We'll take a look at the wheels and the pedals a little bit later on, but I want to focus in on these guys to begin with. So all three models, regardless of which one you go for, are using the same style of electric motor internally. That is a 20-pole servo motor, and it's designed to have low inertia and be cog free. Now by cog free, what we mean, some direct drive wheelbases, and it's not quite such an issue these days as it used to be. If you think back to the early Simagic M10, it was a big problem on those bases. As you rotate the shaft, even when it's energized, when it's powered up, you'd notice little notches throughout the rotation. What that is as the shaft and the housing kind of rotate past each magnet or each pole, you get a sort of snap into the next position. In very basic terms, having more poles more closely spaced together reduces the sort of steps between them and makes for a smoother overall experience. So different designs handle this differently, and you should never test a wheelbase by just rotating the shaft when it's not plugged in and energized. But I can tell you that these three bases do feel relatively lightweight to rotate. Some bases, when you turn the shaft, it feels quite heavy and it has quite a bit of inertia behind it. So that mechanical characteristic of the motor then becomes a limitation in how that motor operates once it's energized. But in these cases, all three, the rotating mass of the shaft is very light. And I also did notice that they're very smooth in rotation as well, even when not energized, which, you know, isn't really a scientific test by any means, but does, at least in my experience, give a little bit of insight into the sort of fundamental characteristics of the motor before it's energized. But obviously we'll talk about all the driving feel and everything as we get on through today's video. But the inherent design here is aiming for low inertia, which means nice and responsive and nice and smooth in operation with no cogging. Now, another feature that they call out behind the scenes is their 24-bit magnetic encoder. So we see this kind of encoder used on most direct drive wheelbases these days. It's essentially a Hall effect sensor which measures the variance in magnetic field as the shaft rotates, and that's how it's able to determine its relative position. So in this case, a 24-bit magnetic encoder which gives 16,777,216 steps of resolution throughout a 360-degree rotation. So what that means is that the wheelbase has a very precise understanding of exactly where it is in its rotation. Now that by itself doesn't inherently mean a good experience. It does ultimately boil down to how the firmware and software is actually managing that information. In simple terms, once again, it doesn't matter how precise the feedback loop is if the electric motor itself isn't capable of, you know, making those little finite adjustments without introducing things like overshoot and so forth. So that's something that we'll be paying a lot of attention to on all three bases as we get into the driving later on. But yeah, all three bases, same mechanical design, just a more powerful motor as we step up through the classes. So let's talk about the actual physical design here a little bit more. So starting off with the quick release, and again, all three models do have the same quick release. You can see it's just a slightly different cosmetic design here on the VD4, and that is to further reduce the rotating mass on the less powerful motor here. So you can see it is a D1 or NRG style quick release. Now, one thing that's really important to understand here, and as you can see, we've pulled the nose off our VD6 here. There is actually power and data transmitted through the nose of the quick release here. So you've got pins on the front assembly, as you can see here. Those interface with pins on the back of the wheel, like so, and you can see all the pins in there. So data and power is transmitted through that mechanism. What that means is that you do have to be careful what you connect to this. Even though it is a D1 style quick release, if you were to go and plug a Moza or a Simagic wheel into this, you are likely to have a problem with shorting pins because their pin configuration is different to what we're seeing here. So there is an easy workaround for that. Actually, two easy workarounds. You can either just put a piece of electrical tape over the face here to blank out the contacts, or you can just simply unscrew it. It's just two screws, as you can see here, and unplug it from the back here. Obviously, you can see very, very flimsy little cables there. So you will just need to make sure that you are super careful if you do decide to unplug this. But once you've unplugged that, you can remove it or just put the PCB back in place unplugged. And that will allow you to use any wheel with an NRG or D1 style quick release, provided that that wheel has the ability to connect back to your PC via its own either Bluetooth or USB connection. So one thing that I think is really missing from the PXN lineup right now is something like what Simagic sell, the QRA, which is basically a D1 or NRG style quick release, which plugs into a Simagic wheelbase and then gives you USB pass-through, so you don't have to run a cable that will tangle up back to your PC. So you can connect your third-party wheel to this via the 70mm stud pattern on the front, plug that into your wheelbase, and you're good to go. Now you can see here the pin configuration on the back of that is completely different to what we have on the PXN wheels. So you can see what I was saying before about not being able to just plug this in, even though it will mechanically fit without shorting out pins and having a bad day. So yeah, that is one thing I do absolutely think they need to add to their lineup very quickly, because that will make it a lot easier and less cumbersome to use other third-party wheels. But otherwise, this NRG style quick release has proven through its usage in Simagic and Moza for a number of years now. ImSource, back when they existed, were using the same quick release as well, and look, we've never seen any major problems with them whatsoever. No excessive play or slop or anything like that. And yeah, I think it's a really good choice. So that is a quick rundown on the quick release. So we then have a aluminium housing. It is a plastic front and rear cover, but we have an aluminium housing here. You can see little ridges here to add additional surface area for cooling. One thing I did notice across all three bases is that none of them got even lukewarm to the touch, even running at their maximum strength for multiple hours at a time. So it does seem that thermals aren't an issue here at all. As you'll see in just a moment as well, there's no active cooling fan internally on any of these either. So there's no moving parts that could wear out, take on dirt and debris over time and stop functioning. So that's something that I always like. I like to keep things as simple as possible in the design. So yeah, aluminium housing here, but plastic front and rear cover. If we flip around onto the back of the wheelbases, and again, all three are identical to each other. You can see the 10 there, and I'll flip around the 6 for you as well, so you can see the internals here. All three do look pretty much identical in the back, so we're not going to open up all three of them right now. So we can see on the back here an array of inputs and outputs. We've got our DC jack here for our external power, our little momentary switch for power here too. So you do have to reach around to the back of the base to switch it off and on, which for me hasn't really been an issue, but if you do have it very close to your screen, you may have a little bit of struggle with that. So on that note, there is a little port here for an emergency stop button, but I don't see that listed anywhere on their website, and it certainly wasn't included in the package with any of these bases. So provision for it into the future, but doesn't seem to be something that actually exists right now. We've then got a USB-A port here for connecting external peripherals, and then a whole bunch of USB-C ports here as well. So one for our PXN pedals, one for other accessories, one for our PXN shifter, and one to connect the base through to our PC. So a nice clean design here. Flip it over to the bottom as well, and you can see the 4 mounting holes. I'll put the dimensions up on the screen for you now, but this is a standard Fanatec mounting pattern. So in terms of mounting on a cockpit, you'll be able to mount all 3 of these on anything that's compatible with a Fanatec or Moza wheelbase. It's also worth noting that there is a metal table clamp available too. That does come included with the VD6 bundles, but if you do need to purchase it for any of the other bundles, you're looking at around $40 US. So just keep that in mind as well. So before we move on and take a look at the steering wheels and pedals, just a quick look at the internals in the back of the VD6 here. And as I said before, all 3 of these are very similar. So we're only going to take a look in the back of the VD6 for now. But if you do want to have a more detailed breakdown or a complete teardown of any of these, let me know in the comments down below. If there's enough interest, we can certainly try and make that happen. And look, there's not a whole lot to talk about here. We can see the 100 watt braking resistor up the top here, a couple of capacitors here. So the encoder and everything is going to be sitting behind this PCB, and you can see the actual motor housing just kind of sitting in behind here. So it is a solid sealed unit there with just the motherboard sitting behind it. And I'm not going to try and remove the motherboard from the back of the motor because it's not really going to tell us a whole heap anyway, and I don't want to cause any issues with the alignment of that magnetic encoder. Given the precision that that has, I wouldn't want to cause any sort of issues that might impact the driving experience at all. But yeah, we can see all our inputs and outputs here. One thing that did have me a little bit puzzled here is this little tiny antenna that you can see sitting on top of this block here. Now, as we already looked at, the RX and TX, or the transmit and receive for the steering wheels, is going through the quick release at the front. So I'm not 100% certain what this antenna is actually for. Now, there is a dash feature, which we'll take a look at in the software section in a moment. That is driven through the PC and using your local network, though. It's not a Wi-Fi direct or Bluetooth connection to your phone. So that's not required for that. So yeah, not 100% certain what that is all about, but I'll try and find out for you, and I'll include a link down below and include an explanation in the written article if I can figure that out before this all goes live. But yeah, look, otherwise, no issues that I see here in terms of build quality. The soldering is all nice and high quality. The cables are nice and thick here as well that are running through to our motor. Those are our 3 phases running from the power output on the PCB through to the motor. And yeah, there's not really a whole lot more to unpack here. So if you do have any specific questions, let me know. But otherwise, I think it's time to move on and take a look at the steering wheels. So a quick overview now of the 3 wheels available within the PXN ecosystem for these VD wheelbases. So this is where, again, I want to mention, in case you skipped out that section of the video, they don't have an equivalent to the Simagic QRA at the moment that allows you to just connect any wheel conveniently with a USB pass-through. So I really do hope that they come out with an accessory like that, which I think will make the entire ecosystem a lot more appealing. But as of right now, unless you want to go a wide connection back to your PC and delete the electronics in the quick release, you are going to be using one of these 3 wheels, and they do come in various different bundles. Again, head over to boostedmedia.net or follow the links down in the description for more of a breakdown on those bundles. But the VD4 bundles come with the WAS steering wheel. This is a 280mm steering wheel. You can see it does have a nice solid aluminium quick release on the back, and that, I will say, is in stark contrast to the carbon reinforced plastic quick releases that you get with the QR2 on the Fanatec CSL DD bundles. Same kind of style quick release as what we get on the Moza bundles that are similarly priced though. So definitely good to see this. And as I mentioned earlier, absolutely no issues with play or slop or anything like that in the quick release. A very nice solid connection. While we're around the back here as well, I will mention that all 3 of these wheels actually do have analog paddles, which do have a bite point mode in the clutch, which you'll see in the software a little bit later on. So both magnetic shifters, which feel pretty good for the money, I will say. Definitely a big step up from the P1 wheel that you get with similarly priced Fanatec bundles. So that was a pleasant surprise, even on the more entry-level wheel here. And yeah, for the price, I am very impressed. The button box itself is a plastic construction, but you can see the actual wheel rim itself is brushed aluminium. And look, ergonomically, it is very comfortable. I like that it's a round design. That makes it nice and versatile. You can drive everything from rally cars to drifting to Formula 1 style cars with a 280mm wheel. And because it is only 280mm in diameter and relatively lightweight, it does make the force feedback feel sharper, more responsive, and a little bit stronger on the VD4 compared to if you drive the same base with these larger wheels. So the wider you go in diameter and the more rotating mass you add, the more load you're adding, fighting against the wheel basically. So yeah, that definitely does make a profound difference. So I think this is a good choice overall. Ergonomically, very comfortable. You can see I can reach those buttons without having to rotate my hand around too much. We do have a D-pad here, as well as A, B, X, Y buttons. Now it is interesting because this isn't a Xbox compatible wheel, but as you'll see a little bit later on in the software look, we do have the ability to map these to both keyboard commands as well as D-pad style commands. So it is very nice and versatile. We've got an RPM strip along the top here as well with a bunch of configuration options that again you'll see in the software section in just a moment. And we do have 2 rotary encoders with push button functionality down the bottom here too. And I was pleasantly surprised with how nice those feel. They have a nice snap or detent in each position. And look, to be honest with you, for the money that you're spending to get the VD4 bundle with this wheel, I think it's actually a really good wheel. It's got a nice faux leather wrap here as well. The stitching isn't absolutely amazing quality, but I'd say it's definitely a pass for the money. The wheel itself is actually surprisingly rigid for the money as well. So yeah, no complaints at all with the WAS steering wheel for the price. I think they've made some really smart decisions here in terms of providing the maximum amount of versatility, considering this is intended to be used on a weaker wheelbase like the VD4. So all good there. We then jump across to the WDSR2 wheel. And again, this is sort of following in the same theme. I did notice the stitching on our particular example down the bottom here is pretty terrible. That jumped out at me straight away. But again, if we flip the wheel around, you can see the same aluminium quick release on the back. You can see the analog clutches and magnetic shifters. And these are very similar shifters to what we find on the equivalently priced Moza and Simagic wheels. So they are magnetic. They've got a nice little snap there. We do have a little bit of adjustment in and out, but no angle adjustment or throw adjustment or anything like that. Again, I wouldn't really expect it for a wheel of this kind of price. Look, visually, I'm not a huge fan of this wheel, I'll admit. I don't really like this, you know, this whole triangle thing going on at the top here, but that's subjective. You guys might really like it. But look, in terms of rigidity, there is a little bit more twist and flex on the wheel rim itself on this particular wheel compared to the smaller diameter. But look, overall, it is perfectly rigid. And again, comparing it to something like the WRC or P1 wheels that you get in similarly priced Fanatec bundles, yeah, definitely a step up in quality. It does have an aluminium rear housing. Look, the buttons themselves, don't feel fantastic. They are, you know, quite flimsy. They do tend to rattle a little bit as well. I noticed when the force feedback was going crazy, there was a little bit of rattle in this particular wheel. We do have a little analog hat switch here. I was disappointed with the feeling of the rotary encoders down the bottom here. They are quite flimsy feeling, although they are aluminium touch points, so little aluminium hats on these switches. But they have quite an undefined detent in each position, and I did find that driving with gloves on, it was very easy to knock these out of position and not realize that you'd done so. With bare hands, not quite such an issue. But yeah, just one thing. Again, for the price, I certainly am not complaining, but it would have been nice to have slightly better quality rotary encoders. Ergonomically though, it is comfortable, 300mm diameter in this case. Maybe not quite so versatile with the D-style shape. You know, it does make it a little bit more awkward for drifting in particular, where the wheel will tend to want to bounce around in your hands rather than just slip smoothly. But you know, it is doable. Personally, I would have rather they had just a round design here. But again, we've got a configurable RPM strip along the top here, and then also a little horn button in the middle here as well. Now you will notice that the buttons themselves actually form a part of the wheel rim here, so they're actually passing through the middle. That is going to mean that if you do want to swap this out for a different style rim and just use this as a button box, that is probably going to be quite awkward, because it will be difficult to find a rim that actually fits within the shape of these buttons. So probably not the most versatile design overall here. And again, for the money, I certainly don't have any major complaints. And then we step across to the larger 330mm diameter WCSR2 wheel. Now this actually looks almost like a hybrid between some of the early Simagic and Moza wheels that we looked at. Exactly the same buttons that we found on the early Simagic wheels. These do have a really nice click to them. You can see they are RGB backlit as well. Now the backlighting does look really nice on this wheel, but unfortunately these aren't stickers. They are sort of permanent fixtures on the wheel. So if you do want to change the labeling, it is going to be a little bit awkward to do so. Unfortunately, the exact same relatively low quality rotary encoders that we found on this wheel. Once again, we do have a little hat switch here, a nice big horn button in the middle if that's something that tickles your fancy. And again, we do have the exact same analog paddles and magnetic shifters that we found on the other wheels. We do have the addition of some 3mm thick carbon fiber paddles on this particular wheel, as opposed to the aluminium ones that we found elsewhere. So one thing I did find with the design of these shifters, there is a little bit of rattle both on this wheel and this one. So when you're driving, you can see they do flop around a little bit. But again, look, when you're considering the bundles that these are coming with in the relatively low price, I think that that's, you know, it's a shame that it does it, but it's certainly not a deal breaker. But really, that was the only complaint that I had. Same aluminium quick release once again here. The rear housing on this particular wheel is made of plastic, but again, relatively rigid, no meaningful flex in the quick release whatsoever. Being a larger diameter wheel, there is a little bit more twist in the wheel rim itself. But yeah, overall, I actually quite like the relatively clean design of this particular wheel, and this one as well. I don't like a lot of the wheels, and again, this is a subjective opinion here, but I don't like a lot of the wheels that have, you know, colors flashing everywhere and just, you know, they try to look really busy. And that's kind of what I don't like about this particular wheel. It's just visually quite busy to look at, whereas these two are very clean in design. And yeah, I think they've done a good job overall. Let's move on and take a look at the pedals. Depending on which bundle you might be looking at getting will determine exactly what you get here. So let me just pull up my notes here. So if you get the VD4 bundles, that comes with a 2-pedal set, so throttle and brake, obviously. And if you get the VD6 bundles, they come with the 3-pedal set. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, these pedals are pretty basic. They get the job done, but they are using Hall effect sensors. They are position based. There's no load cell or anything like that. And they don't have any real sort of definition to them whatsoever. Look, I was able to, after a number of days of driving, get pretty close to my regular lap times, but there's just not really any finesse or any character to these pedals at all. One of the things I always look for in a set of pedals is the ability to sort of feel a clearly defined threshold point that you can always match with your braking, so that you can brake consistently and then modulate around that pressure point. So these pedals just don't really have anything like that, particularly if you're buying the 2-pedal set. You can actually see here all 3 pedals are mechanically identical to each other, so they're just using a Hall effect sensor to determine the position. So if you get the 2-pedal set, they are literally identical. If you get the 3-pedal set, then you do actually get this little elastomer and spring stack included in the kit. And as you can see, this just inserts into the rear housing here like so. You just squish it down and it'll pop into the little slot just there like that. And that does give you a little bit more definition underfoot. Now look, I did still find that I was just pushing that all the way down to the maximum and not really getting any additional feel out of that. Now look, admittedly, I am used to using very high-end pedals and I do prefer a stiff pedal, but this little stack here is only rated to 10 kilograms of force to max it out, whereas, you know, most people when they're braking in a real-life race car are going to be using at least sort of 50, maybe 60, 70 kilograms of force. So look, you can adapt to it, but definitely consider this to be an entry-level set of pedals, and it's priced accordingly. You know, we weren't really expecting anything more than this out of it, but this is the only offering within the PXN ecosystem right now. So look, again, being a PC compatible only piece of kit, it does mean that you can run any pedals that you like. So you're certainly not limited to these, but look, they're definitely the weakest part of the puzzle. And that is unfortunate simply because, you know, the pedals that you're using are the most important thing on the rig. The other thing I would mention here as well is that they do have a tendency to slide around on the carpet as well. They don't have any sort of carpet spike built in. They do have just some little rubber pads here, which does an okay job on tiles. But if you are looking at driving on carpet, even with the elastomer stack removed, you will find that they'll slip and slide around a little bit. So yeah, definitely some improvements that could be made on the pedal front. But look, again, when you factor in the price of these bundles, I certainly don't think that they're terrible. One thing I would just mention comparatively here is that if you're looking at Fanatec bundles, those do have the option or the inclusion, depending on which one you go for, of a genuine load cell based brake pedal, which does give you a lot more definition and precision than what you're getting with this. So that's definitely something that I wouldn't take lightly. That is definitely a strength of those bundles over what we're getting here. Okay, so time to take a detailed look at the PXN sim racing software. This is going to be the software that's responsible for managing any PXN hardware that you have connected to your PC. Remembering importantly that these bundles and wheelbases are only PC compatible, at least at the time that we're filming this video. So that does mean that you can mix and match peripherals with other brands if you wish to do so. You're not locked into only using their shifters, handbrakes, pedals, and so forth. So just keep that in mind as we're going through this, but it does keep everything within their ecosystem nicely contained in the one software package. You're not going to have separate software packages for different peripherals. So at face value, this does look very similar to the software we see from a lot of other manufacturers, particularly SimPro, which is the Simagic software. If I quickly drag that across, you can see a very, very similar layout here with tabs down the left-hand side that allow us to navigate around the various different sections. And then if we go down to our devices, you can see tabs along the bottom here to select the different peripherals and adjust the settings pertaining to each one, just like what we see with the SimPro Manager. So if you're familiar with that, it is very similar, but let's go through and unpack this in more detail now. So on the home screen, we've got latest news from the company. We've got our wheel center adjustment and our maximum steering angle. We've got a quick adjustment here for our force feedback overall strength, and then a quick representation of our 3 pedals as well, so we can check to make sure that they are within calibration. We've got a game launcher up here as well, so that allows us a quick and convenient way to launch the various different games that it detects on our PC. And then over on the right hand side here, we've got a section called driver's license, and you can log in here. It just asks you for an email address and password, and then it sends you an email to verify. It doesn't require you to give it an email address or log in to use the basic features of the software. It doesn't unlock any advanced features or anything like that. So yeah, you're not forced into giving away your precious details if that's something that concerns you. So that is a quick rundown on the home screen. We'll just quickly jump down to our settings screen here as well. So we've got a couple of things we can do here. Pretty typical stuff: launch on startup, minimize to system tray on close, minimize to system tray on launch, enable original DPI scaling as well. So if the interface isn't quite working with the scaling that you have on your particular PC, then you can change that. And then also a button here for updating the software to the latest version, so you don't have to go digging around in a browser to see whether you're running the latest version. We've got a tab here for help as well, which basically just loads their YouTube channel, which is quite cool. So it just sort of embeds it here and goes through their various different guides and setup tutorials, which is always a good thing to see. We've got a tab here for firmware updates. Pretty much works exactly the same way as what we see within the Moza ecosystem. So you just click on the button for each one. If there's an update available, it takes it through the process with a one-click sort of solution. So definitely not as convoluted here as we see with some other ecosystems where you have to go and find a firmware package, tell the program which file you want to flash, and it can be quite nerve-wracking to people that aren't familiar with doing that kind of thing. So yeah, nice and easy within this ecosystem, which is good to see. We then got our tab here for games. So this is like an extended version of the game launcher that we saw on the home screen, and this allows us to assign different profiles for wheelbase, steering wheel, and pedals to each of these games. So they do actually have some pre-baked profiles, which did do a pretty good job as a baseline setup that you can then tweak to your personal preference for a variety of different games here. So it's good to see they've gone to that effort. You can also set it here to automatically apply the appropriate wheelbase profile when you launch the relevant game too. So that is quite cool. But I think most people are probably going to end up tweaking and creating their own profiles here anyway. And then we've also got a pretty cool little integrated dashboard feature here as well. Now there aren't integrated LCD dashes on any of the wheels or even a separate accessory that you can bolt onto your wheelbase at this point in time. But this is pretty cool. So if you click on scan to connect here, it brings up a QR code. When you scan that code, it literally just opens up a web browser. And provided that your phone's connected to the same network as your PC, it just loads the local IP address of the PC and you're presented with a nice little integrated dash here. And there are a couple of different dashes that you can load as well. So if we click on more, you can choose between a few different profiles here. We scroll down, you can see. So no ability to customize these in any way. So certainly not as powerful or customizable as what you have in SimHub, for example, but it's nice to see this integrated into their native software. You know, they didn't have to do this. So yeah, I think that's quite a nice little touch there, and it does seem to work quite well. So then we come to our devices tab, which is where we make all of our adjustments to the hardware. So actually we may as well start off with pedals here since we're already on that tab. So starting at the top here, you can see we do have the ability to create, save, export, and import profiles. So if your mate's got a really awesome pedal profile that you want to test out, that is a possibility, or you can send your profiles to your mates as well. We then have the ability to reverse the output of each pedal. So that is just a compatibility option for some games out there. No sim that I'm aware of requires this, but there are some games that may do. So good little thing to see there. And then we get down to our output curves. So you can see there's a couple of different profiles here for non-linear curves if you want to do that, or you can just grab each individual node and move those around to your heart's content if you want to create a non-linear response curve. Now, because all three of these pedals are position based and there's not really a whole lot of feel under them, I don't find this to be particularly useful for these particular pedals. Often on a clutch pedal, for example, you might use this to match the mechanical rollover point that you feel in the pedal to the bite point of the clutch in the car by doing something like this, for example. So that would become your bite point around the top here where it rolls over. But on a completely linear pedal, I don't find that to be particularly useful. On the throttle pedal, for example, if you're driving something like an MX-5 or a GR86, something that doesn't have a whole lot of power, you may want to set a more aggressive initial response so it ramps up more quickly. Conversely, if you're driving something like, say, a Porsche 911 Cup car that is rear-wheel drive, lots of power, and no traction control, you might want to tone things down a little bit and have a more smooth onset of power so that you don't spin on corner exit. So personally, I don't tend to run non-linear profiles for anything, but that is a subjective preference. You do have the option there should you wish to do that. One thing that I did notice that seemed to be missing was any sort of calibration for the pedals. Now in my case, you can see when I push the pedals to the floor, using those Hall effect sensors, it is reaching 100% full scale deflection and returning to zero, but there's no dead zone adjustment or anything like that. So if you do have a habit of resting your foot on the brake as you're driving, you don't have the ability to dial that out. So calibration and dead zone adjustment are two pretty fundamental things for any sim racing pedal set that are missing from here. And those are both things that I would like to see them add into the future. We do have the ability down here to adjust mapping though. So if you want to map a pedal to some other form of output, you do have the option to do that as well. So that is a nice little touch. But yeah, being Hall effect position-based pedals, calibration is less important than it would be with load cell. But if you do find that your throttle pedal isn't going to quite 100% when you push it down as far as you want to push it down, then you just don't have the ability to adjust for that, which is not real great. So then we can jump across to our steering wheel settings here. Now, obviously the settings here will be determined by the wheel that you have connected, but you can just hot swap these. So we just connect one wheel, we connect another wheel like so, and we should see that pop up as soon as we go back to the steering wheel tab. There we go. So yeah, the settings here will be determined by the wheel that you have connected, but you can just adjust basic things like button mapping here. So it is interesting, as we mentioned in the hardware look, that the buttons are kind of labeled as if they were Xbox wheels, but we don't actually have Xbox compatibility. So a little bit strange here, but as you can see here, we can map each individual button to various different wheel functions as well as keyboard keys. So that is actually quite a nice touch, because a lot of gaming devices don't actually output a keyboard signal. So you have to use a program like Joy to Key to assign some things within certain titles. Not such an issue these days, but it used to be quite a big thing. So it is really nice that you can actually assign these buttons directly to a keyboard command in here. So I thought that was quite a nice little touch. We do have a calibration tool here for the little joystick on the wheel. We don't have it for the pedals, but we do have it for the joystick. So I thought that was quite strange, but we've already covered the inputs and outputs of the wheel, so we don't really need to go through all of that again. We then have our tab here for RPM lights. So we can make adjustments here to the threshold point for each individual light. We can also change between various different modes. So we've got a standard, which goes from left to right. We've got a racing, which just requires higher RPM to get going in the first place. We've got a focus mode here, and then custom, where we can create our own profile. We also have the ability to adjust our brightness here as well. So if it's burning out your retina, you can make adjustments there. You can also set the RPM to just be constantly on as well. And you'll notice in some of our driving footage, I actually hadn't realized yet that you had this telemetry mode. So you might notice that the lights are just on all the time. That is the reason for that. If you do notice that later on in today's video. We then also have adjustments here for our analog paddles. So we've got our left and right paddle. We've got a linked clutch mode here too. So this allows us to set a bite point. So you can drop one paddle and then it will go to the bite point that you preset, and then you can release the second hand to get underway. So you would set that to the bite point of the car you're driving. When the lights go green, you would release one hand and then release the other side. So that's a nice thing that we expect to see on high-end wheels, but not necessarily more entry-level wheels like what we have here. And all three of these wheels that they've sent us, so the one that comes with the VD4 bundle, as well as the other two, all do have integrated analog paddles, which I thought was a very nice touch and not something that we're used to seeing on more entry-level bundles like that. So yeah, nice little thing to have there. And then we move across to our wheelbase settings. This is where the fun happens. So we can see an adjustment here for our center. So if your calibration for wheel center is slightly off, you can calibrate that. We've got a strength limit here for the bump stop at the end. Being a direct drive wheelbase, it can just spin infinitely. So when you reach the mechanical limit of your lock angle here, which we'll explain in just a moment, you can set how stiff you want that end stop to be. So soft, pretty soft, medium, a little bit stiffer, and then hard is more like hitting a brick wall, but you can still pull past it if you wish to do so. So I generally just leave that on hard, but it's a subjective thing, whatever you prefer the feeling of. Now you will notice that there are little tool tips next to each one of these items, and these are explained in plain English. We'll go through some of these as we go through some of the more complex settings today, but that is something that I always look for. It makes it a lot easier for beginners to not feel overwhelmed. It makes the software a lot more accessible overall, so that is a nice touch. We then have our lock angle. So this is just basically the sensitivity of the wheel, or how much it's able to rotate. So in most cases, you're going to leave this set to 900. For some rally style driving, sometimes you might want to decrease that to 540. For F1 games like the Codemasters F1 games, for example, or EA Sports, I should say, you're probably going to want to set this to 360 degrees of rotation. You do have the option here to wind that all the way out to 2600 degrees of rotation for truck sims and titles like that. So that is always a good thing to see. I'm going to set that back to 900 for now. We then have our maximum rotation speeds. This is where we start to get into some of the more complex features. So not to be confused with slew rate, for which we don't have a dedicated adjustment on these bases. Maximum rotation speed is basically just the maximum velocity of the rotation, as it explains here. So hardware limit for the wheel rotation velocity. Higher values enable faster force feedback response, but reduce stability. Lower values improve stability at the cost of responsiveness. So I found on all three bases, I preferred to have this completely maxed out. I just found that the bases did feel a little bit on the vague side if we ran anything less than 100% here, particularly on the VD4 and the VD10. The 6, maybe not quite so much, but we'll elaborate on that a little bit more when we get into the driving experience in just a moment. We then have our force feedback overall strength. So you can think of this like a volume control or gain adjustment for the actual signal that's coming out of the game. So most games have a gain adjustment built into them. Generally, what I would recommend is to leave this set to 100% and then adjust the gain in the actual sim title if you're finding that the wheelbase is clipping and you're just not getting those detailed effects that you would expect to get. We might actually do a separate video at a later time discussing clipping and exactly what it means for those who might not be 100% certain on that, but it's a little bit beyond the scope of today's video. Below that, we then have mechanical max torque. Now, as this says here, the peak torque that the device can physically output. Force feedback signals exceeding this value are clipped to prevent overload. It is recommended to coordinate with force feedback strength to maintain a safe signal range. So Most people are going to want to leave this set to 100%. That is going to allow you to use or utilize the full dynamic range of the wheelbase that you're running, particularly if you're running the VD4 or the VD6. I can't think of many scenarios, unless you've got small children running on your rig, where you would want to reduce the mechanical output, because that is going to limit the ability of the wheelbase to produce effects between little granular details like road textures all the way up to things like impacts and so forth. So I would suggest leave this set to 100% so you've got full dynamic range available, and then adjust your in-game force feedback down if you're feeling that the effects are a little bit too strong. That will ensure that you're always going to be using the full available dynamic range of the wheelbase without running into clipping. So that is important. So then we start to get into the more subjective settings down here. So mechanical inertia. So this ties in with mechanical friction to provide the sensation of the steering wheel being mechanically connected to something inside the car. So when you're turning the steering wheel in a real car, the tires and wheels obviously have some weight to them. So if you really turn the steering wheel very quickly, you'll notice that the wheels tend to want to sort of continue in the same direction that they were turning, and that creates a little bit of inertia that you sense in the steering wheel. So having that simulated here gives a little bit more of a sensation of the wheel being physically connected to something inside the car. But having said that, it is a filter, so having this cranked up too high will start to have a damping effect on some of the other more granular details that you might feel through the wheel. So I would always recommend start down on the lower end of the scale and then slowly work it up if you're not quite feeling that it is providing that physical connection sort of sensation that you're looking for. Now, I do tend to run my mechanical friction and inertia a little bit higher than some other people like to, so it is purely just a subjective thing here. You just don't want to be getting into a scenario where the settings that you're running here are taking away from being able to feel what the car is actually doing. So hand in hand, mechanical friction gives a sensation of weight behind the wheel. So as you're turning the wheel, you feel the weight of the tires sort of scrubbing against the road surface. So again, you can adjust this to your heart's content. I would recommend, again, start down the lower end and then slowly work your way up until the wheel feels more realistic to you and the type of car that you'll be driving. But again, remember, the more you crank this up, the more it's going to be pulling away from some of those granular details. So there's definitely going to be a sweet spot there, which is going to be different for everybody. And then we get into mechanical damping. So a speed dependent resistance that increases as the base rotates faster. Higher values equal more stable steering, ideal for low speed new drivers. Lower values equal enhanced force feedback detail, hardware level adjustment independent of game force feedback. So pretty self-explanatory there. If you're finding that wheel feels a little bit robotic to you or just a little bit overactive, then you can add a little bit of damping to counteract that. But again, just like what we were discussing with mechanical friction and inertia, the more damping you add, the more it is going to dull down those more granular details. So there's definitely going to be a subjective sweet spot there that you're going to want to find to suit your personal preference and, again, the type of car that you're driving. But I would err on the side of running less. And with these particular wheelbases, in all three cases, I actually found that I preferred the feeling with no mechanical damping added on top of what was already coming out of the game's force feedback signals. So not to be confused with the maximum rotation speed, what I would generally recommend is, if you're finding that the wheel is just a little bit overactive, I would crank this down before cranking this up. So yeah, you can fiddle around there to your heart's content to find what feels good to you. And then we don't want to miss the advanced settings tab here either. So this allows us to make adjustments to the outputs actually coming out of the game's force feedback signal here. So game damping, self-aligning torque, and game friction. You can think of these once again like volume controls for the signals coming out of the game. In most cases, you're going to want to leave these set to 100% and just make adjustments within the game itself. And then over on the right-hand side here, we have some advanced filters too. So filter level reduces high frequency force feedback artifacts for smoother force feedback and quieter bass operation. Higher values suppress more noise but may diminish detail. Adjust independently from force feedback detail. We've then got force feedback detail here, amplifies chassis level force feedback effects, ABS pulsations, tire scrub, curb vibrations, etc. Higher values intensify effects, may become overwhelming. Compatible with filter settings, adjust simultaneously. And then mechanical centering. This is like an override that creates a spring effect to make the wheel return to center. You can see at the moment with that set to 0, any position I put the wheel in, it's just going to sit there. If I crank that up to 100%, you'll notice now the wheel is going to spring back to center again. So sim racing titles, every sim racing title these days has its own centering force built in, so you can leave that set to 0. If you're playing some more arcade style games, you may find that the wheel just feels sloppy and you might want to add a little bit of mechanical centering to counteract that. But in most cases, you're going to want to leave that set to 0. So with filter level and feedback detail, what I found is on all 3 bases, adding to these just kind of made the base feel a little bit too robotic to me. And I just found the sweet spot for me tended to be to leave these set to 0 and make use of things like mechanical inertia, friction, mechanical dampening, and rotation speed to sort of bring out the detail that I wanted. But I felt like the baseline here was pretty good in all cases. But if you are finding that the wheel is just too hyperactive for you, you can add a little bit of filtering here. And conversely, if you're finding that the wheel just doesn't feel detailed enough for you, you can increase the feedback detail. And this is almost like a multiplier on top of the force feedback detail coming out of the game. So what I found is increasing this just makes the effects start to feel robotic. Road textures just start to feel unrealistically overpowering, and it starts to actually pull detail away from, you know, feeling the sensation of what the car is actually doing on the surface of the road. So again, these are subjective things. You can filter and adjust these things to your heart's content. It's good that you have the option here, but for these particular bases, all 3, I found that leaving these set to 0 provided the most realistic feeling for me. And that is a run through of all the settings available here. Up the top here, you can see, just like what we saw with pedals for steering wheel and wheelbase, we do have the ability to save, import, and export profiles. Under preset list here as well, I actually didn't notice this at first, but we do have the option here to choose between those official profiles that we were looking at earlier, local profiles, so these are profiles that are saved on your PC. And then over here, we do have a tab for cloud profiles as well. Now, you may have noticed on the home screen before I wasn't logged in. I have now logged in, and that does allow us then to access the cloud profiles. Now, at the time of filming, if we go back to this under cloud, there are no cloud presets. So there doesn't at this point in time appear to be the ability to actually upload a local profile to the cloud. So I'm not 100% sure whether this is fully integrated yet or exactly how this is meant to work. But you can see, in theory at least, up here, we've got the ability to filter by game, filter by tags as well. So you might have a profile for Assetto Corsa and then a filter here for drift, for example, that would only load drift related profiles and so forth. So lots of potential here. Not something that we see in a lot of other ecosystems. So it'll definitely be interesting to keep our eye on this and see how it fleshes out over time. But that is a quick rundown on all the various different settings and adjustments that are available here. So to summarize quickly here, not as much granular adjustment as we see in some other ecosystems. To some people, that might be a good thing because it does make it nice and accessible. What's important to me, particularly at this kind of price range, is that we are able to dial in a pretty good overall feeling across all 3 of the bases. So in the case of the VD4 and the VD6 in particular, I didn't really feel like I wanted any more adjustment than what was here. Again, sort of acknowledging the segment of the market that these are in. Now, there are going to be some people there that disagree with me and just want to be able to adjust absolutely everything. And maybe we will see some more advanced parameters unlocked into the future. I'm not sure about that. But with the VD10, things were a little bit different. I did sort of wish that I was able to fine tune things a little bit more. So I think that's a good opportunity now to talk more about the overall driving experience across all 3 of these bases and wrap things up with our conclusions. So let's have a chat now about what all this is like to drive in. I'm going to keep this mostly centered around the 3 wheelbases because I feel like I've already told you everything you need to know about the wheels and pedals to make your own decision there. And really, you know, if the driving experience isn't good with these bases, you're not going to be looking at the wheels and the pedals anyway. So if you do want any more details on those, let me know and I'm happy to answer any questions. Check out our written review as well for a little bit more detail on that. But what is it like to drive with these wheelbases? So the expectation was set based on what we were talking about before with the characteristics of these motors, that they would be very smooth and very precise, and that certainly was the case for the most part. I did find them to be smooth. There was no cogging, no hint of torque ripple or anything like that. So that already puts them in the same kind of ballpark as a lot of the competition that they're up against these days. It certainly didn't disappoint me in that sense. One thing that I was paying particular attention to was things like rapid change of direction, quick transitions through chicanes or drifting and things like that. Often a more entry-level direct drive wheelbase tends to struggle in those scenarios. You feel like there's a disconnect between what the car is doing or what you're asking of the car and the wheelbase's ability to keep up with those inputs. But that didn't really appear to be the case with any of these 3 wheelbases. We put them all through their paces using pretty much the full suite of available sim racing titles and all sorts of different styles of driving, from rally all the way through to GT3 Formula style. We did some Super Formula, we did some drifting as well. And drifting is often where a lot of those kinds of shortcomings will become most apparent, because you're asking a lot of the wheel. You're wanting to sort of flick it around very quickly, and if there's any kind of disconnect between what you're asking of the wheel and what it's actually able to deliver, that becomes pretty quickly apparent. But all three of the bases were able to keep up under all of those scenarios, so that was a good thing. And they were relatively consistent across the different sim racing titles as well. Now, different sim racing titles obviously have strengths and weaknesses. One of the big weaknesses in iRacing at present is that some circuits don't have a lot of detail in things like grass textures, ripple strips, and so forth. So that can lead to inconsistencies in things like track detail and so forth. And we notice that across pretty much every single brand of sim racing base. So that does have a bearing on the specific cars and tracks that we test with through our testing. We try to test everything with the same cars and tracks to get a good baseline. And as I mentioned in a couple of other posts recently, we did actually go back through and test pretty much all the other competitor products that's classed in the same kind of area of the market to get a good understanding of exactly how these compare. So to summarize, on the good side, smooth, responsive, no hint of torque ripple, and yeah, they did provide a good sort of baseline driving experience across the board. Now, what I did observe, and I actually started with the VD10 and then worked my way down in the testing, because I wanted to sort of get a feel for what the best of the best had to offer and how that experience diminished as we went down through the bases. Given that they all have a similar mechanical design, I wasn't expecting to feel a significant difference in the overall driving experience, strength aside, but that wasn't really the case. So the VD10 honestly didn't give me a good overall impression in terms of the wider driving experience, those nuances aside. So while it was smooth and responsive, the finer details, things like track textures, even just little movements of the car's suspension, just felt rather robotic to me. It was like traveling back in time to the early Moza wheelbases, and I just felt that it didn't quite deliver on my expectation straight out of the box. Now, Tom and I spent probably the better part of a day just fiddling around with all of the various settings that you saw in the software section of the video. But look, I mean, the more filtering we added, the more dampened down things felt. And this is sounding very reminiscent of some of the early Moza reviews once again. So we were finding that we were having to add a lot of filtering to remove that kind of robotic feeling. But then in doing so, you end up having to trade off of damping down and muting the effects that you actually need to feel to get a good sense of what the car's actually doing underneath you. So, changes of direction and things started to feel a little bit more sloppy. Movement of the suspension, bumping up over ripple strips and things like that just didn't quite have the definition that you experience of other products at this kind of price point. Now, we're comparing this directly against things like the Moza R12, the Simagic Evo Sport, for example, as well as a CSL-DD with the 8 Newton meter boost kit, which is a little bit less powerful, but does provide an overall pretty good driving experience. And you can check out our full review of all three of those other bases for more details there. So we were running latest firmware, latest drivers, and we were running the latest hardware revisions of those Moza bases as well. So yeah, the VD10 left me with a okay, but I feel like it needs to be more for it to be something that I would recommend over those other alternatives kind of impression. So then we set this one aside and we moved down to the VD6. And look, I was expecting this to be pretty much the same driving experience, but just not as strong. And this one actually surprised me. I didn't find that it had that same robotic characteristic. And, we did spend a lot of time once again playing around with filters and trying to, bring out as much detail as possible. But we found that this thing actually gave us a pretty good, pretty well refined driving experience overall. While not being as strong, the granular details just felt a little bit more clearly defined than what we had with the VD10. Now, I still wouldn't say that it was particularly outstanding or groundbreaking. I'd say that it's, while the VD10 was maybe a little bit below its competition in terms of driving feel, this was probably more on par with the bases that it's directly competing with. So we're talking Moza R9, CSL-DD with boost kit, and so forth. So yeah, I was actually quite happy with the driving experience here. Certainly not as strong. And look, I would say that, for most people, the sweet spot sits somewhere between about 9 Newton meters and 12, maybe 14 Newton meters if you're a really strong upper body person. So at this kind of strength level, it is something that probably at some stage in the future, you're more likely to want to upgrade from. Whereas if you're looking at a base that sits more at this kind of level of strength, 10 Newton meters or a little bit more, you're less likely to want to upgrade from that later on. So while it did provide an overall good driving experience, again, there wasn't really anything here to sort of wow me and make me sort of think, all other things considered, that this would be the one that I would recommend over the competition. And let me just quickly give you a breakdown here. So comparing that directly against the Moza R9 V3, which feels to me a similar kind of strength level, remembering this is 6 Newton meters continuous, whereas the R9 is peak. But you're looking at very similar prices there between the two, quite similar driving experiences overall. But when you consider the wider ecosystem of products, particularly steering wheels that Moza has to offer there, it does make it more difficult to recommend this, even though the actual raw driving experience is quite similar. So that's my take on the VD6. Then we jumped down to the VD4. And look, the experience was pretty good here. It was pretty similar to what we'd had with the VD6, obviously a little bit weaker, but look, the detail was there that I needed to drive quickly and consistently. And yeah, I think that it did do a good job overall. But look, in direct comparison again to Moza's equivalent product, the R3, which is 3.9 Newton meters of torque, that does feel a little bit weaker overall than this does. But again, you've got that wider ecosystem. You've got all those different wheels that you can just, click straight on and drive away and not have any issues. You also have Xbox compatibility as well, although it is a little bit more expensive for the Xbox compatible version of that package. So look, I mean, all things considered here, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with any of these products. I just don't think that comparing each one of these 3 models against their direct competition, they offer really any specifically compelling reason to go this direction over other better established brands. And again, look, it may be completely different where you live in the world. You might live in an area where PXN ends up being significantly cheaper than any other option. And in that case, I wouldn't have any issue at all recommending the 4 or the 6. The 10, I want to see how that evolves over time. But what I would say here, trying to sort of analyze what was going on here, it feels like the characteristics of these motors are leaning more towards a lower inertia, smaller physical size motor. When you sort of amplify that, when you extrapolate it out up to the level of the VD10, that's where we started to have those issues where things sort of started to fall apart in the driving experience. So I don't know whether it is just a characteristic of these motors where, as the motor gets larger, things sort of just start to come apart a little bit. That kind of seems to make sense to me given what I understand about these motors, but maybe I'm completely wrong there. Maybe the issues that we had with the VD10 are things that they'll be able to address in firmware updates later on. We've seen, even just recently, you might have seen my recent video talking about the Simagic Evo bases and how a firmware update made quite a significant change to how those bases feel. We have seen that happen across pretty much every brand over the years. I think back to the early days of the Fanatec DD1, DD2, and how firmware updates completely transformed those. I remember the same thing happened with the Moza R9, R12, 16, and 21. Those were completely changed with the firmware update as well. It happened with VRS as well. It's happened with pretty much everybody. So maybe into the future, they'll be able to improve the feeling overall with the VD10. It's not a bad wheelbase at all, but it certainly does have its shortcomings compared to other competitor products that sit at a relatively similar price point. So in summary, they're certainly not bad products, but they just don't quite have that extra little something that I was hoping they might do to make it an easy recommendation over the competition. So look, it's really great to see more competition in this sector. That's something that's ultimately going to be good for us sim racers because it's going to mean more competition drives pricing down. Hopefully it doesn't kill innovation in the process, but that's a topic for another video. But yeah, good products overall, but looking at the wider ecosystem, I just don't see a reason to recommend these over other alternatives, and it's as simple as that, guys. So I really hope that today's video has helped you out. If it has, please do hit the thumbs up button. Make sure you subscribe to the channel as well so you don't miss out on future reviews and comparison like this one. As I said multiple times now, check out our full written review and our direct drive buyer's guide as well. If all of this is confusing you, that will definitely help to clarify things. And yeah, if you do decide you want to pick up any sim racing gear, whether it's one of these bases, one of the other ones we've talked about, or anything else, head over to boostedmedia.net for all the latest discounts and our affiliate links, which are an awesome way of helping support the channel without it costing you an extra cent. So we really do appreciate your support there. But above all, guys, thank you very much for watching today's video. Leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think of these new PXN bases. Would you buy one of these? Would you buy something else? Do you already own something else? Are you happy with it? Are you wishing you'd gone with something else? Always good to have these discussions. And yeah, looking forward to continuing down in the comments. So I'll see you there. Thanks for watching, guys. See you later.